something extremely interesting slipped out during a recent Twitter space, and if you were paying attention, you probably caught it too. A Ripple employee casually confirmed something that many people in the XRP community have speculated about for years. It wasn't framed as a massive announcement. It wasn't presented like breaking news. But if you understand how to read between the lines, you know exactly how significant it was. In this video, I want to break down what was said, why it matters, and why this could quietly validate one of the strongest longstanding XRP theses. And we also need to talk about the chart because an indicator just flashed that you cannot ignore right now. Before we get into it, I just want to say I appreciate every single one of you who takes a second to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you realize. And if you're looking for a platform to grab some XRP, check out the link in the description. Now let's get into it. So here's what happened. During the space, the discussion shifted toward upcoming amendments to the XRP ledger, specifically permissioned domains. If you've been around this community long enough, you already know why that phrase should grab your attention. For years, critics argued that institutions would never use a public ledger. The narrative was always the same. Banks need control, banks need compliance, banks need privacy. Therefore, they would never operate on something open and decentralized. But what was hinted at in that conversation confirms the exact opposite direction. Permissioned domains essentially allow institutions to operate within defined environments on the XRP ledger while still leveraging the underlying public infrastructure. In other words, it bridges compliance with decentralization. That is massive. Because one of the strongest long-term bullish arguments has always been that XRP would position itself as the neutral bridge between traditional finance and decentralized liquidity. And now we're seeing the technical groundwork to make that happen in a structured way. This isn't speculation anymore. It's not just a community theory floating around on forums. It's being openly discussed by people inside Ripple. And if you look back, this pattern repeats. The XRP community identified the implications of the SEC case long before mainstream media understood it. They speculated on major banking relationships long before documentation surfaced. Time and time again, early interpretations have eventually aligned with reality. That doesn't mean every theory is correct, but it does mean the community has a track record of spotting direction early. Now pair that with what's happening on the chart. We just saw a major technical signal flash, one that historically precedes volatility expansions. When this indicator compresses the way it has, it usually means a significant move is coming. Not guaranteed up, not guaranteed down, but big. And when you combine structural development on the protocol level with compression on the price chart, you get a setup that demands attention. This is why I'm watching so closely right now. Fundamentals quietly aligning, technicals tightening, sentiment divided. That combination doesn't stay quiet forever. For a long time now, one of the biggest questions inside the XRP community has been why certain amendments, especially permission domains, were being prioritized so aggressively. On the surface, you could argue it's just product development, but when you actually zoom out and think about what permission domains enable, it becomes obvious this is not random. This is infrastructure. This is compliance architecture. This is the type of tooling that large financial institutions require before they even consider touching public blockchain rails. Permissioned domains create an environment where institutions can transact with clarity, knowing exactly who is on the other side, knowing that compliance standards are met, and knowing that regulatory exposure is minimized. For years, many of us speculated that Ripple would not be building these institutional features unless they were being directly requested. It never made sense that they would push clawbacks, compliance layers, and permissioning standards without active dialogue happening behind the scenes. And then on that recent Twitter space, something changed. A high-level Ripple representative directly confirmed what many had suspected. They stated very clearly that these features are not being developed just in case institutions might come. They are being implemented because institutions have explicitly said they need them in order to go live. That distinction is massive. It shifts the narrative from hopeful anticipation to active preparation. It means conversations are happening. It means requirements are being gathered. It means adoption is not theoretical but conditional, Ripple is essentially building the runway so that when these institutions are ready, they can flip the switch without friction. That aligns perfectly with what many long-term observers have believed. Ripple has been educating, cultivating, and preparing partners quietly for years. These amendments are not marketing gimmicks. They are deployment prerequisites. And if that's true, then what we are witnessing right now is not experimentation. It's late-stage integration planning. That is a very different stage in the life cycle of a technology. When infrastructure upgrades are being tailored to institutional specifications, it signals seriousness. It signals alignment. It signals that blockchain rails are being molded to fit within the existing financial framework rather than replace it overnight. And that's important because real disruption doesn't happen through chaos, it happens through compatibility. If Ripple is building exactly what institutions are asking for, then the idea that XRP becomes embedded within cross-border settlement flows becomes far more realistic. It suggests that when the regulatory climate stabilizes and the green light is given, the operational foundation will already be in place. That confirmation changes how you interpret everything else happening around the ecosystem. It reframes delays as preparation, not stagnation. It reframes amendments as strategic, not speculative. And if institutions truly are lining up requirements before deployment, then the timeline becomes less about if and more about when. That subtle shift in framing is incredibly powerful for anyone paying attention. Now, on the other side of this conversation, something happened that perfectly exposes the education gap that still exists inside traditional finance. A Federal Reserve official publicly questioned the usefulness of cryptocurrencies, especially in domestic systems, arguing that stablecoins could pressure banks and reduce lending capacity. He went further, challenging the practicality of crypto for cross-border payments. His example was simple. If someone sends money to family in the Philippines, even if it arrives instantly, it still has to be converted into local currency, which adds cost and friction. And in trying to discredit the utility of digital assets, he unknowingly described the exact problem that XRP was built to solve. That's what makes this moment so fascinating. The XRP ledger functions as a decentralized exchange at its foundation. It was architected to move value between currencies seamlessly, using XRP as a bridge asset in the middle. In the scenario he presented, USD could be sent into the ledger, automatically converted into XRP for liquidity purposes, and then converted again into Philippine pesos on the other side. The recipient receives local currency. The sender never needs to hold XRP long term. The bridge exists for seconds, not days. The fee is often fractions of a penny. Settlement finality happens in seconds. There is no need for correspondent banking chains, no multi-day delays, no excessive FX spreads stacked at every intermediary checkpoint. That is the bridge model in action. And the critical misunderstanding in his argument was the assumption that everyone would need to use the same currency or the same platform for the system to work efficiently. That is not how XRP is designed. XRP does not require sovereign currencies to disappear. It does not demand that countries abandon monetary policy. It simply provides neutral liquidity between systems that already exist. It connects rails rather than replacing them. That distinction is enormous. Interoperability is not the same as dominance. XRP's value proposition has always been about reducing friction between financial ecosystems, not consolidating them into one global currency. What makes the critique even more revealing is that it comes from individuals deeply experienced in banking and monetary policy, but not necessarily in distributed ledger architecture. They understand lending cycles, capital requirements, and liquidity ratios at a macro level. But blockchain infrastructure operates under different technical assumptions. That difference in framework often leads to surface-level dismissals. And yet we are more than a decade into blockchain development. This is not an experimental white paper phase anymore. The infrastructure is live, the rails are functional, enterprise integrations exist, liquidity corridors have been tested. To continue dismissing the technology without fully understanding its mechanics becomes increasingly difficult to justify. For those paying close attention, this gap between perception and capability represents opportunity. Markets often underprice what influential voices misunderstand. When policymakers publicly question a utility that already functions in practice, it suggests broader comprehension has not caught up with development. And historically, when education eventually converges with innovation, repricing happens quickly. It does not unfold slowly and politely. It happens in sharp adjustments once recognition sets in. That is why moments like this matter. They reveal how early broader awareness may still be, even if the underlying infrastructure has quietly matured far beyond the narrative surrounding it. And this is where sentiment becomes one of the most important pieces of the puzzle, because while infrastructure upgrades are being quietly finalized and macro voices continue misunderstanding the technology, the market itself is flashing signals that are extremely difficult to ignore. Right now, XRP sentiment is sitting near historic lows, levels that in previous cycles have only shown up near major long-term bottoms. When you layer together fear and greed indexes, social engagement metrics, funding rates, relative strength indexes, and broader macro oversold conditions, what you start to see is not random weakness but compression. You see exhaustion, you see apathy, you see the kind of emotional fatigue that typically forms after prolonged consolidation and disappointment. That does not mean price cannot dip again. Markets love to test conviction. They love to squeeze both sides before choosing direction. One final liquidity grab, one final panic wick, one final headline shock event is always possible. But when you zoom out and overlay these current readings against XRP's full historical chart, it becomes increasingly rare to find similar clusters of data that did not coincide with accumulation phases. The statistical alignment matters because markets are driven by human behavior and human behavior is cyclical. Extreme optimism often precedes major tops, and extreme pessimism often precedes meaningful reversals. What we are witnessing right now looks far more like capitulation than euphoria. Retail confidence is low, social conversations are skeptical, even long-term holders are questioning timelines. And yet, at the exact same time, institutional focused amendments are being confirmed as demand-driven, not speculative. That divergence is powerful. On the surface, price action communicates frustration and stagnation. Beneath the surface, protocol development communicates readiness and preparation. Historically, those two forces do not remain disconnected indefinitely. Eventually, price reconciles with structural progress. The only variable is when that reconciliation occurs. Could XRP defy its historical rhythm and continue bleeding despite these signals? Yes, markets are not obligated to follow precedent, but probabilities are not random guesses. They are informed by repetition. And when multiple independent indicators converge at levels that have previously marked generational lows, dismissing that alignment becomes statistically unwise. The asymmetry begins to shift. Downside risk gradually compresses while upside potential expands. Sentiment extremes reduce incremental selling pressure because most emotional participants have already acted. When doubt saturates the market, new negative catalysts have diminishing impact. That creates space for stabilization, and stabilization often precedes expansion. If institutions are indeed positioning quietly while public sentiment deteriorates loudly, the setup becomes even more compelling. This is not blind optimism. It is probability layered on infrastructure confirmation. And when readiness, misunderstanding, and pessimism converge simultaneously, history suggests that what feels like stagnation is often the calm before structural repricing.